In this video, we're going to show you how to get the most out of the Mavic 3's zoom lens. Now, some of the tips here are Mavic 3 specific, but a lot of them apply to any kind of zoom filming. We're going to show you some creative concepts to get the most from your drone. So let's roll the montage and we'll come back and have a chat.
What's a man got to do to get a woman like you? What's a man got to do to touch a woman like you? What's a man got to do to get a woman like you? If I have to beg, or if I have to plead, or if I have to fight, or if I have to bleed, or if I tell a lie.
Stewart here, pleasure to talk to you as always. Now, the first thing we did when we got our hands on a Mavic 2 zoom years ago was take that drone to the top of a mountain and try and recreate some of those epic 90s and 2000s helicopter gyro-stabilized aerial shots. They're done on zoom lenses. You can't get a helicopter close to things, and as a consequence, you get these amazing parallax effects. So yes, it is cool that a 7x zoom lens lets you get close to things, but from a filmmaking perspective, the real value is being able to take advantage of the compression that takes place between your foreground, your midground and your background, throwing in a little bit of rotation so we can see those layers moving at different speeds and really taking advantage of that parallax. So tip number one, create depth in your shots, foreground, midground and background elements. Because you're flying a drone, you might be up high pointing your 7x zoom at the ground. In all likelihood, that's not going to create any layers in your image. Get the drone down a bit, see if you can get those foreground and midground and background elements in your frame. The second tip concerns camera movement. Because we're zoomed all the way in, we don't have the wide angle field of view that gives us the sense of motion we're accustomed to when flying a drone. As a consequence, we need to find a new way of creating motion in our shot. And building on this idea of layers, if we do rotational movements around a subject, we get this tremendous sense of parallax, much like those Hollywood aerial shots I showed you previously. You can still get good results flying forwards and backwards, but because of the compression that takes place when using a zoom lens, our motion is compressed. So you're really going to need those foreground elements to give the camera a sense of movement as it travels through space. Now that you understand how to create depth in your frame and the kind of camera movement that complements this zoom lens cinematography, you can use your drone much like you would use a handheld gimbal. You can get close to your subject and do nice rotations around your subject for those nice cinematic moves. And the added benefit here, in the case of the shots we were filming the other day, I didn't need to worry about tripping over rocks or moving fast enough or whether or not there was a pavement I could actually stand in. I just slid the drone around as carefully as possible whilst keeping Alina in the center of the frame. So once again, just because you can fly high doesn't mean you should. You can do more with your drone. It's such an exciting piece of kit. Now, before we get on to our Mavic 3 specific tips, be sure to grab yourself a copy of our free ebook From Drone Zero to Drone Hero, 37 tips to get you flying like a filmmaker. And if you really want to get into this, we have an 8-hour drone cinematography masterclass that takes you from drone owner to drone pilot to drone cinematographer in a very informative and entertaining way. The Mavic 3 is unquestionably a fantastic drone, but for some reason or other, the 7x zoom lens has a ton of restricted functionality that is quite hard to work with from a professional perspective. But when there's a will, there's a way, so let's get into some of that now and give you some tips to get the most out of that lens. There are no manual exposure controls on the 7x zoom lens, just auto settings, and that has one huge consequence in this instance. If you put an ND filter on that camera, the evaluative metering system says, oh, it's too dark, we need to boost the exposure in whatever way we can, and it shoves the ISO up. Now, you don't actually get to see what those ISO settings are because it's all automatic and it's all hidden, but you can certainly see it in the picture quality. Given that Alina and I are absolutely obsessed with creating parallax-style rotational movements with any camera, we even did a video here showing you how to do a Michael Bay-style super cinematic rotational shot with a DJI gimbal and a normal camera. That's how fixated we are with it. So not being able to get motion blur is a real problem because with this lens compression and with these layers in the shots and those swooshing backgrounds, it doesn't look that great if we can't get the motion blur the eye's accustomed to seeing when watching cinematic footage. As a consequence, the next tip has to be don't go too mad on those rotations, otherwise it's going to look really, really jaggy. And that's exactly the result we got way back with the Mavic 2 zoom when we didn't have ND filters and we went for it with those parallax moves. You can just see how the background is jumping away there. It would look a lot better if and when we get manual exposure controls and we can put ND filters on that zoom lens. Telephoto focal lengths introduce a phenomenon that we're not super familiar with as aerial cinematographers, and that is shallow depth of field. If your subject is filling the frame, shall we say, somewhat close to the camera, there is a possibility that your background will be out of focus. As a consequence, it's absolutely essential that you remember to focus the camera. Now here on the Mavic 3 we have two focusing options, autofocus and manual focus. If you have the camera set to autofocus, when you press record it will set focus automatically, which is good, but that autofocus is continuous, and this is something I really hope DJI will change in future. Back in the day you would get autofocus continuous and autofocus single. Autofocus continuous continuously hunts for focus throughout a shot. Now that's fine when you've got a wide angle and everything is in focus, but now that you have the possibility of shallow depth of field and certain elements of the frame being in focus and certain elements not, you can't afford to have the computer in there hunting for focus during a shot. It needs to find a focus point, stick with it, and stay with it. Unfortunately, the hunting nature of this continuous autofocus ruined many of our shots, so we definitely recommend that you use manual focus. Added to that, go into your camera settings and select focus peaking, so when we are focusing manually, we have a better sense of where that focus point should be. Now we have a fixed and hopefully accurate focus point, we don't need to worry about the camera hunting during your shot. The longer the focal length of the camera on the drone, the harder it is to control the movement of that drone. Longer focal lengths enhance vibrations, jitters, jerky stick movements. So switch the controller onto Cine and make sure you're moving those sticks as smoothly as possible. As we've established, there are only automatic exposure settings in the camera, which means the evaluative metering system is looking at the image as a whole and setting an average exposure that satisfies that entire image. But that's not always the exposure that you want. If you have highlights in your shot, like bright white clouds that you want to protect the detail in, or if you have people in your shot, you don't want those faces or the skin tones being blown out. So if you need to make an exposure adjustment, even though we're in automatic settings, you can make an EV compensation adjustment. And this is something we did all the time for these shots. At least this gives you a little bit more control to set the exposure that you want for your shot. Unfortunately, however, we don't get an auto exposure lock that you normally see in such situations. This locks in your settings, literally, so they don't change during the duration of that shot. So in this instance, if we do a rotation and we open up darker parts of the frame, the exposure of the image will still change, albeit with our EV comp at -2, for example, but it still changes the exposure mid-shot, and that is super annoying. So that is yet another thing that we need to see on this 7x zoom camera added by DJI. Currently we're restricted to 30 frames per second on the 7x tele lens. Now normally I would say slow down your footage to 80% to give you a 24 frames per second piece of footage for your 24 frames per second timeline. It kind of works here. The only thing is, because we don't have motion blur on those backgrounds that sometimes are swooshing by with our lovely parallax, if we slow that down to 24 frames per second, you can see jitter in those backgrounds. So it's a kind of knock-on effect, all stemming from the fact we don't get manual exposure controls, we can't use ND filters, and as a consequence we don't get the motion blur the eye is accustomed to seeing when watching cinematic footage. So at present I think we're going to be restricted to shooting and editing and presenting our footage at 30 frames per second. Assuming you're looking for a nice image quality, then stick with the 7x telephoto lens. That gives tons of lens compression for those nice rotational parallaxy movements. If you go to the digital zooms of 14x or 28x, it's going to be very hard to control the camera, and also you're deteriorating the picture quality quite significantly anyway. DJI have marketed this 7x telephoto lens as a kind of explore mode as opposed to a cinematic tool. Now, as you'll have gathered from this video, I don't really see it that way. If you put a lens like that on a premium professional product, expect professionals to try and use it professionally, and that's what we're trying to do here. Now, fortunately, all that's required From what I can tell are some software upgrades, namely manual exposure settings, absolutely essential, autofocus single or more granular manual focus controls, so we get more control over setting a manual focus, given that we now have this phenomenon of shallow depth of field and out of focus parts of the image. And we absolutely need more frame rate options, namely 24 or 25 frames per second. With all of those, we can put our ND filters on and get some really nice cinematic footage using this as a cinematic tool and not just some kind of toy explore mode, to be honest with you. Anyway, as you've seen, with a little bit of understanding, you can get amazing shots, and hopefully we've inspired you with whatever drone you've got to go out and do the same. Don't forget to grab yourself a copy of our free ebook. As you know, we've got that 8-hour drone cinematography masterclass, and we will see you next time.